Hi everyone. Okay, so for this week, we're going to try to clarify what Leibniz means by primary truths, and we're also going to try to tackle two other related topics, which are what is the relationship between what Leibniz calls primary truths or metaphysical truths and physical truths. So, what is the relationship between physical laws and metaphysical laws? And we're going to talk about that in much more depth. So, if it sounds a little confusing for now, that's okay. And then we're also going to try to talk about why it is that Leibniz nonetheless believes that human beings are free, even if God can know everything that every human being will do throughout all time from the first moment of eternity. And so that is a very complicated idea, but I think that it goes really well with what Leibniz calls primary truths. Now, so the idea of primary truths, what Leibniz is trying to demonstrate are truths which are eternal, right? And the model for these kind of truths is mathematical truths, right? 2 plus 2 equals 4 would be true even if there were no objects in the universe, right? It expresses mathematical fact that holds regardless of whether or not there actually are, two or more things in the actual universe. And so these truths are interesting for Leibniz primarily because of their unconditional nature, right? They're not, the truth or falsity of these propositions doesn't actually depend on the nature of anything else in the universe. And in fact, Leibniz's notion, Leibniz's concept of like a complete concept of something where the subject contains every predicate, right? Really his model for this would be geometry, where he looks at Euclid and he sees, for example, Euclid's definition of a circle or something like that, where it's like all points are equal distance from a center, right? And then from that, Euclid believes that you can then derive all of the other properties or characteristics of a circle, right? And then similarly with like a triangle and other geometrical shapes. And so the idea here is that if you have a really robust or fundamental definition of some subject, in this case we're talking about shapes, then we can systematically determine all of the properties that follow from that definition. And so these primary truths are supposed to be truths that are like mathematical truths in the sense that they don't actually depend on anything else in the universe, right? Like if you want to give an account of gravitational force for the Earth, then that's dependent on facts like the mass of the Earth, for example, right? And so those would be facts that are ultimately dependent on other kinds of facts, as opposed to the primary truths. And the reason why Leibniz calls them primary is because exactly they cannot be derived from anything else. And for Leibniz, these are truths which are, he says, quote, co-eternal with God, which means that they are concepts or laws or ideas which are so fundamental to the structure of the universe that you need them in order to understand what God is, right? These are truths which are equally as eternal and fundamental as God, that without them that you can't have a notion of God, and that you cannot imagine some alternative notion of God, at least so Leibniz believes, that doesn't have these qualities or characteristics. These primary truths function as something like the basis for God's decisions. And it's important to recall here the fundamental difference between Leibniz and Descartes is that Descartes believed that, for example, when a God was determining the laws of arithmetic and geometry, that God just sort of decided that they should be this way, but that he could have decided any other way, right? And so in that way, Descartes makes the truths of arithmetic and geometry dependent on God's will. Now, on the contrary, for Leibniz, it's not that God can arbitrarily decide to make these laws true or false. In fact, they are true independently of God's will, and God's will reflects them, that they become reasons for why God creates and orders the universe in the way that he does. So they thus form sort of the basis for God's decision-making process for Leibniz. And they're concepts necessary to make up the concept of God. God cannot be God without these concepts, right? And so they form metaphysical principles. Because they form the basis for God's decision-making process, right? Then they're ordering or structuring dimensions of God's creation. God created the world, right? And even all possible worlds with these laws in mind. And moreover, since God's creation follows directly from God's ordering of the universe, these are principles of God's creation without external influence, and that Leibniz believes that it follows that all truths about God's creation can be resolved into these principles. So ultimately, all truths can be reduced on some level to the primary truths that Leibniz is investigating. And part of the reason why is because God is not compelled by anything that God doesn't take to be a good reason, right? And so there's nothing external to the primary truths that can motivate God to create the universe in one way rather than another way, right? These, for Leibniz, are the exhaustive principles that determine the nature of God's creation, so our universe, fundamental reality. It follows that all truths about the universe can be resolved into the principles of God's creation. So if we really want to know about the universe, then we should try to discover the fundamental laws or principles governing the universe as God creates it, right? And so let's just go through a couple of these principles that Leibniz provides in the text Primary Truths. The first truth that Leibniz discusses is the principle of identity, that something is identical with itself when it has all of the same predicates in common. So from this point of view, I'm Penelope by virtue of having all of the predicates of Penelope, right? Not only the ones that manifest at this particular time, but the ones that manifest at all times, right? And what makes me me is specifically that I have this grouping of predicates, right? I, was born at a particular time, I'm a particular height, and, all of this kind of stuff, all of that comes to form my identity. And then similarly, Leibniz's principle of difference is that something is different from something else than when it has one or more predicates that they do not share in common. So for example, if there was like a Star Trek villain that was like Ghost Penelope or something like that had all of the same properties or characteristics that I had, but was born at a different time, right? Like they were created in a lab or something like that, right? I don't know. That would be sufficient to differentiate Penelope from Ghost Penelope, right? Because then we would have at least one predicate that we didn't share in common. And in fact, we would have a whole number of them because in addition to being born at a certain time, right? Then I had the predicates where it's like my first word occurred at this certain time, right? And then Ghost Penelope wouldn't have those predicates in the same way at all, right? And so even having just one predicate that is different from Ghost Penelope or Robot Penelope or whatever implies a whole series of differences, right? And so you can kind of see how these two principles hold for everything, right? Everything is what it is in virtue of having the number of predicates that it does, and things are differentiated by having one or more predicates differentiated. And this might sound very basic, right? It sounds like something that basically everybody knows. Something is the same if it has all the same stuff that it used to have, and it's different if it introduces one or more new things, right? But that's a good thing for Leibniz. These principles should be obvious, right? If they were controversial, if they only held in certain circumstances, then they wouldn't be fundamental principles of the universe. So it's perfectly acceptable for Leibniz that these are very obvious to you. And in fact, Leibniz thinks that they should be obvious to you, right? And here you can kind of see how Leibniz is the father of formal logic, insofar as he's trying to discover the principles that govern our reasoning at the most basic or fundamental level, and that they're formal principles, right? They concern not like the content of my identity per se, but the identity of anything whatsoever, right? And so you're trying to discover absolutely general principles that we can know, hold regardless of circumstances. And so in this way, he's really anticipating developments in formal logic. Now here's a couple, so the basic idea is that if you start from these principles, like the principle of identity and the principle of difference, that you can arrive at principles that have more content than that, right? Principles that are more informative about the nature of the universe. And so a couple of more principles that Leibniz discusses in Primary Truths that he sees as consequences of the principle of identity and the principle of difference. One that Leibniz discusses briefly is the principle of Muriology, that parts are smaller than the wholes that they're a part of. Why? Because to be a part of something means that you take on some subset of their predicates, right? But you don't take on all of them, right? And so you can see how these two principles of identity and difference can get you principles about Muriology, about the relationship between parts and wholes, right? And that's what Muriology means. That's why I call it the principle of Muriology, is because it deals with the relationship between parts and wholes. That parts are smaller than wholes because they take on some subset of the predicates that the whole has, however that the whole remains different from the part because the part is only a subset and so does not include the entire set of predicates that the whole has, right? Okay, here is maybe the most important principle that you get in Leibniz, which is called the principle of sufficient reason. It says that nothing happens without a reason. That is because for something to become different, for an event to happen, it has to take on one or more new predicates, right? And so what this means is that everything in the universe is structured such that you can give a reason for why it is the way that it is. And this is going to be very, very important for Leibniz's conception of God and Leibniz's conception of the universe, and ultimately like why Leibniz is providing, at least partially, a scientific image of the universe, right? We're going to talk more about how the principle of sufficient reason is a very important principle for the development of physics, right? Nothing happens without a reason, because for something to become different than it is involves taking on one or more new predicates. This has as a consequence another principle, the principle of the identity of indiscernibles. And here the idea is no two things are only numerically distinct. So what Leibniz means by that is that, if you have like two writing instruments or something like that, right? In this case, they can't just be differentiated purely by number. Like, even if I had two of these, I guess, G205 pens, right? And they were right next to each other, right? And I had one in each of my hands, then Leibniz says, based on the previous principles that we've mentioned, that we can get a reason, right, for why they are different from each other that goes beyond just the fact that they are differentiated by their location in space, right? They have to have some properties, some predicates that make them different from one another. So like, even if I had two of these and they looked exactly the same because of, industrial production practices and so on, that Leibniz would say, okay, but if you had a God's eye perspective, then you would see that the exact number of molecules of ink that are in one pen is actually different than the number of molecules of ink that are in another pen, and that this is related to, how they went through the production process and the machine, and, maybe one got a certain amount more than the other, and so on and so forth. And this is the sort of knowledge that we don't have because we're finite, right? And we are not able to very accurately track all the similarities and differences between objects, but that if you were God, that God would be able to know with exact certainty all of the differences between those two objects, even if they looked exactly the same as one another, right? And so Leibniz's formula for the identity of indiscernibles is to say that for things to be different, there has to be a real difference. There has to be a difference not just in the number of them, but in their predicates. There must be something contentful that is different about them that justifies why we would refer to them as being numerically distinct, right? That's very it's very difficult. Okay, one more principle that we're going to talk about. I know that can be kind of overwhelming, right? But we'll go back over sort of the wider arc of these principles. Final principle that we're going to discuss for now. Principle of continuity. And what this principle says, and this is actually, I think, better explained by Emilie du Châtelet, who we're going to discuss more in just a little bit. She describes this principle by saying, quote, that nothing is done through a leap in nature, and that being does not go from one state to another without passing through all of the different states that we can conceive of them, right? So if we're imagining like the movement from the pen being here to the pen being here, right? That we have to conceive of it as passing through all of the intermediary states between the two locations. It's not possible for there to be like a jump where at one moment the pen is here and then it pops out of existence and then it arrives over here, right? God simply does not structure the universe in that way, and you can know that from the principle of sufficient reason. For there to be a kind of jump in the universe like that, there would have to be something that violates the principle of sufficient reason. There would for each time slice where the pen is moving, you can articulate a reason for why it's at the exact location that it's at that particular time slice, right? Okay. So I know that was like scattershot, like here's 5 fundamental metaphysical principles of the universe in 5 minutes or something like that, right? And so that's maybe like a little bit complicated, hard to understand. But the general gist of what Leibniz is doing is that Leibniz thinks if you start with the most basic principles for anything to be what it is, then you can just sort of follow the inferences from those principles to arrive at more complex principles, right? Like, it seems like Leibniz starts out by saying everything is what it is because it is what it is, right? It's almost like a tautology until we get to the principle of continuity, which seems to make a very, very, very specific claim about like the nature of the universe and how physical objects proceed through the universe and so on. But Leibniz sees it as a direct consequence of the principle of identity, right? That if you just follow his reasoning, then ultimately everything follows from these principles that are co-eternal with God. And so you can kind of see, again, why Leibniz is considered one of the founders of formal logic, even if he didn't develop like a rigorous formal system himself, is because he sees that if you start out with axioms that describe the most basic moves that are possible within a formal system, then you can, from those principles, develop more complicated pictures, more complicated implications, and develop more complex notation to deal with harder cases, right? Okay, and so this might be rather puzzling because it might seem like there's like a weird jump that happens almost, right? Like at some point you're discussing like metaphysical principles, so principles about how like the fundamental nature of reality and how God would create the universe, right? To descriptions of how physical objects move through the universe, right? At least it seemed that way from the principle of continuity. And one thing that you might think, right, is that, well, physical laws, we discover those through experiments, right? Through our sense data. There's something that we discover in the world, right? Whereas metaphysical laws can never be really discovered that way, right? The metaphysical laws are more like the laws that we use to understand at a baseline what is discussed by physical laws. And it seems like they ask fundamentally different questions. So, like, what is the relationship between metaphysics and physics? And, you know, this has sort of been at the heart of, like, what a lot of the rationalists were trying to do. Like, in Descartes, you know, you have the argument, the Cartesian argument for the existence of God, and then that allowed Descartes to say, okay, God exists and God is all good, so God would not deceive us about clear and distinct ideas. And this is why we can be pretty certain about, you know, the laws that we discover in physics, right? But this seems like kind of a really external connection between metaphysics and physics rather than like a very concrete one. Leibniz, on the other hand, really wants to get at the foundation, the foundational elements that are required for doing physics, right? And this is really what the Émilie du Châtelet reading is all about. And she was a totally fascinating figure in the history of philosophy. She wrote about 50 years after Leibniz, like 1740, I think is the text that we read. She was sort of like at the center of intellectual life in France. She was the translator of Newton's works on physics. She was herself a scientist. She was extremely well read in philosophy. Obviously, the piece that we read for this week tries to directly relate Leibnizian metaphysics to the practice of physics. And so in that way, it's like super, super fascinating. We have this tendency now to think about religion and science as fundamentally at odds with one another, right? Because they occupy different institutions. It seems like they have fundamentally different forms of explanation, right? Um, and it kind of, I think that it's easy to get this impression that with the growth of scientific knowledge, that what happens is that the domain of religious explanation gets smaller and smaller and smaller until it more or less shrinks out of existence, right? And then you move from a sort of religious worldview to a natural scientific worldview, right? And one way that people describe this is as sort of like the disenchantment of the world. Like, we learn that nothing happens in the world for no reason, nothing happens in the world for sort of, the religious reasons like that we had previously thought about, but that we can explain everything purely through mechanical and physical laws. But this is really sort of like a 19th and 20th century response. That if you actually look at these 17th century figures and 18th century figures as well, that they actually thought that the existence of God was necessary for science. And I think that, while you can choose to read this as them just sort of capitulating to the institutions, the church or whatever else, that it's really not necessary to read them this way. That Newton, for example, thought that for the discovery of his physical laws of the universe, that you needed a god. Why did you need a god? Because presumably, if there's no god, right, then the universe is not ordered, right? The very idea of physical laws stems from their understanding of God ordering the universe in a certain way. And it's because the universe is ordered that we can come to know and understand it by examining physical laws, the interactions between objects and so on and so forth, right? Whereas, their belief was that if there isn't a God, that things could just happen randomly. Things could just pop in and out of existence. It's not really possible to ask why things are the way that they are. You can only ask why things are the way that they are if they're ordered by something with intelligence, right? And this is the basic idea behind a lot of the physicists during this period, and why you get the language about laws of nature is because they're literally laws set down by their understanding of God, right? And so in that way, Newton, as well as other scientists during the period, thought that the existence of God was an important enabling condition for doing physical investigation. But you might think, hey, like, they were just wrong about that, right? Like, maybe you think that the universe can be structured in a certain way, even if there's not a deity or a creator of the universe who, determinately organizes it in such and such a way. Okay, but that's fine. But what the Emily du Châtelet reading really points out is just how much the metaphysical principles that Leibniz was pointing out were essential in framing the sort of original project of what we now conceive of as the foundation of modern physics: Newtonianism, Galilean science, right? Copernicanism, and obviously, Leibniz comes some time after Copernicus, right, or Galileo, but what du Châtelet really wants to argue is that Leibniz has made explicit the metaphysical principles that were operating implicitly within Galileo, within Newton, within Kepler, within all of these other figures, right? And that Leibniz has sort of laid out explicitly the principles that make the physical investigation of the universe possible, right? And that Leibniz's metaphysical principles has important implications for how we actually study and understand physics. And this is especially relevant in terms of space and time, and how to understand space and time. one way of thinking about it is that physics, when we do like sort of like a physical investigation of the world, that it takes for granted a certain metaphysical picture of the world, right? So like if you do physics and you think about objects in space and they have force and motion, right, and they interact with each other and they produce certain effects, right, then you already have in your ontology, or your sort of like belief about what exists in reality, individual objects and relations and forces and so on. And if you go into a physics class and you try to ask like, okay, but like what is an object? Like what is a force? Why is there something in the universe? Why are there forces rather than being nothing? Then the physicist will, perhaps rightly, just sort of think that you're confused, right? That physics takes for granted the existence of these objects, right? And attempts to describe the nature of their relationships. But that physics, for the most part, is not really engaged in this sort of reflective deliberation of like, okay, but what are the most important concepts, right, that we can utilize in the sort of explanations that we're trying to give. And so this is where the Emily du Châtelet reading is really helpful, is that she points out that without the metaphysical principles that Leibniz takes up, that the modern scientific project doesn't really work, right? So, for example, without the principle of sufficient reason, it's unclear why it is that we can demand a physical explanation of everything, right? So imagine a case where like we're playing pool, right? The philosophers of this period will call it billiards, but we're playing pool, right? And I hit it, and I hit the white ball against the 8 ball or whatever, right? And I hit it with a certain degree of force, and we can use sort of that knowledge to explain why it is that the balls move the way that they did, right? Like there's a certain amount of propulsion that I had whenever I, hit the white ball with the pool stick, right? That causes it to move at a certain determinate angle with a certain determinate speed. It reaches a collision with the 8 ball. That impels some degree of force to each of them, and they occupy new locations, right? And so with physical explanation, I can try to say, okay, why is it that the 8 ball landed in the exact location that it did? Like, why is it, where it is instead of like 2 or 3 centimeters, to the left or to the right, right? And it's always possible for me to provide these sort of explanations in physics. I can always ask, why is it that one, object occupies the location it does? Why is it that, it's affected by the relationship between forces in the particular way that it does? And physics really tries to understand that. But if you don't have the principle of sufficient reason, if you don't have the metaphysical belief that any change in physical objects or locations has some sort of reason for why it is the way that it is, then you open the possibility of sort of like jumps or leaps in nature, elements of physical reality that are fundamentally unexplainable. And if you have that, then you can't have the modern approach towards physics, where we can discuss all physical objects as being in a mathematical and determinate relationship with one another that we can come to know, right? And then similarly, like, part of the explanation for how the billiard balls move the way that they do presumes Leibniz's principle of continuity, right? Like, part of your explanation for why it is that the 8 ball ended in the determinate location that it did is your presupposition that it has to travel through every, inch of space between where it was originally hit and where it ends up, right? So for Emily du Châtelet, Leibniz's metaphysics explains how and why it is that we can give physical explanation for phenomena. And so in that way, it is essential for, as the text itself suggests, the foundations of physics. Similarly, Du Châtelet argues that it should impact how you understand space and time, which are essential, right, for doing physics. Like we're trying to describe changes in locations in space that occur throughout time, right? And so these are essential concepts for physics. And Leibniz's theory of space and time, Albert Einstein says, influenced his own development of the theory of relativity of space and time. Why? Because some philosophers, like Newton, thought that space and time were kind of like absolute containers, right? There's like, it's kind of hard to imagine, but you know, like try to imagine like a zoomed out picture of the entire universe, like you can see like all the galaxies and stuff like that. And so Newton imagines like certain determinate boundaries that occur sort of like at the edges of space, and that it's a container that contains everything, like as if the whole universe could like be in a bag or something like that, right? And so in this way, space is absolute. Space is something that is independent of the things that are within space, right? And it has an existence on its own, regardless of whether anything comes to occupy it. And also part of Newton's explanation for his theory of space and time is that God sort of like created something like a giant coordinate plane, and that's like space, and then created objects that fulfill that space, that, you know, enter the coordinate plane in one way or another. Now, Leibniz's theory of space and time is the exact opposite of Newton's. Whereas Newton thinks that space and time have an independent existence, right, of the things that occupy it, Leibniz says the opposite. Leibniz says that space and time are orders of things. They're not things. And so Leibniz's proof of this actually follows on the metaphysical principles that we've discussed. So, you know, try to imagine Newton's conception of space, where space is completely independent of all the things that could potentially occupy it, right? Now take some slice of that space, right? And take another slice of that space and maybe imagine them next to each other, right? Leibniz says there's nothing, right, that can differentiate empty space from itself. There's no basis for taking the first piece of empty space, which you might call empty space A, and empty space B, right? There's no predicates that can differentiate them, right? And so in that way, what that means for Leibniz is that you have no basis, you don't really have a concept of what it is that you're thinking about, right? That it's impossible to imagine like two like slices of space or something like that that exist independently of one another, but that don't have like really any properties or predicates that differentiate them. For Leibniz, just like in mathematics, like you can sort of like you can like choose to examine like a particular slice of quantity, right? That what space is that you're just examining things that are simultaneous, right? So like this marker and this pen, they exist in space together because they exist at the same time, right? And then there's an order in space such that like we can describe them, you know, one as being to the left of the other, and so on. But your ability to do that depends on the items that are actually taking up space. So for Du Châtelet, that's really important for thinking about physics, and obviously the developments of physics in the 20th century with Albert Einstein. Albert Einstein said explicitly that he was drawing on Leibniz's theory of space and time to discover the relativity of space-time. So that is pretty incredible, you know? Both that Leibniz's theory was important for the development and establishment of Newtonian mechanics in physics, but also that his work was essential for the overcoming of Newtonian mechanics in physics, right? And so Leibniz has both of these elements with this philosophy, and that makes it really fascinating to try to think about Leibniz and physics. Okay, the last thing that I want to talk about is really freedom, right? Because many of you brought this up in your homework assignments, which is something like, hey, if God could see and understand everything that will happen in the universe, right? And God knows, like, from your concept, everything that you will do in the future from all time, right? From the first moment of eternity, God knows every single decision that you will make throughout the entire course of your life, and presumably also for Leibniz, the afterlife, right? And that seems to contradict our notion of freedom, which usually says that freedom is the ability to do otherwise, right? Like, you know, we kind of think that, like, we should be able to, like, surprise God, right? But Leibniz tries to give a picture of why it is that even on his conception of God, that free will is consistent with it, right? Okay, and so to get at this, we really need to discuss the difference between teleological and mechanical forms of explanation. And so what I'm going to ask you to do is I want you to imagine a watch, right? In a watch, you can explain how it functions by explaining part-to-part relationships, right? So, like, why is it that the watch can accurately tell time? Well, if you want to engage in a mechanistic explanation, you would start to explain how all of the parts of the watch come and work together, right? You would say, oh, the gears mesh in such a way such that it produces, you know, the second hand moving in a certain determinate manner, right, that corresponds with the passing of seconds, right? And this would be sort of like a mechanistic explanation of the watch, right? But another sort of explanation that you can give of the watch is that we can ask not only, you know, why is it that these parts work together the way that they do, but we can also ask, like, why did someone make the watch? What function did the watch serve, right? And so in this case, we're no longer talking about part-part relationships, we're talking about part-whole relationships. So, like, why did someone, presumably, like, you know, an engineer, create the whole edifice of the watch? Not just, like, how do certain parts interact and mesh together, but why is it that someone would produce the whole watch? And, you know, your answer would be, right, to track the time, right? That's the function of a watch. That's what the whole mechanism does together, right? In this teleological explanation, because you're examining the whole thing, you have to give some sort of, like, external explanation, an explanation that's not imminent to the workings of the watch, but that appeals to the design of the creator of the watch, right? Okay. And so one way to understand the early modern period is to say that what happens is that there's a sort of conflict between mechanical forms of explanation and teleological forms of explanation, right? That what happens with Copernicus is that we get a new mechanical explanation for the order of our galaxy, namely that we revolve around the sun rather than vice versa, right? And this seems to contradict the teleological sort of explanation that we had used up until that point. And so one way that people understand the modern period is as sort of the emergence of really sophisticated forms of mechanical explanation that emerged with development of scientific paradigm in Galileo, Newton, Bacon, Kepler, Copernicus, and so on, right? And the sort of downfall of teleological explanations of nature, right? That we no longer try to explain nature by talking about God's design or something like that, right? That's what gets excluded from the new scientific paradigm. But what Leibniz tries to do, and what makes Leibniz unique as a modern philosopher, is that he tries to imagine God as the most perfect engineer, right? And this metaphor is really the foundation of how Leibniz thinks about God, right? In the same way that like we can ask both mechanistic and teleological questions about a watch, so too Leibniz thinks that you can ask mechanistic and teleological explanations about the universe. You can ask mechanistic questions about the universe, like why does a billiard ball occupy the particular location that it does after a certain physical interaction, right? But then you can also ask teleological questions about the universe. And Leibniz's chief example of this sort of question is, why is there something rather than nothing? Why is there anything in the universe at all, right? And this sort of question is going to be the kind of question that mechanistic explanations can never adequately explain, right? Because they presume that there are things in the universe, right? And so it doesn't have this sort of conceptual toolkit to be able to answer the sort of question, why is there something rather than nothing? And so part of Leibniz's project is to try to say that, hey, like the mechanistic sort of explanations that are offered by the moderns, they're right. They're indisputably right. Of course it's the case, right, that the earth revolves around the sun rather than vice versa, and that it's a kind of magical thinking to suggest the opposite, that, the sun revolves around the earth because God, reflects his image in human beings, and so they're at the center of the universe or the galaxy or whatever, right? And Leibniz's solution to all of these problems, really to the problems of modernity, right? The problem about this apparent disenchantment of the universe, right? The way that it seems like the sphere of religion sort of like goes away as mechanistic explanation increases, is to say that God is the most perfect architect, right? And so God established mechanistic principles because those are the best, most efficient way of ordering the universe, right? And so rather than see mechanistic and teleological explanations as in conflict with one another, Leibniz just says that mechanistic and teleological explanations are asking two different sorts of questions about ultimately the same thing, which is the order of the universe. And that God is so perfect as an engineer and as an architect that he can create a creation that operates according to physical or mechanical laws, but that also produces the best of all possible worlds. So in other words, it's precisely because it is that we can explain the universe in a mechanistic fashion that it is the best universe. That part of what makes the universe the best universe that it is that it affords the possibility of mechanistic explanation, right? And so they're just explanations from two different levels or points of view. The teleological explanations occur at like a metaphysical level, right? Whereas the mechanistic explanations occur at a physical level, right? To describe particular sorts of interactions. And the fact that these cohere for Leibniz points to the perfection in the way that God established the universe, that God established a pre-established harmony of the universe, that the sort of explanations that you provide at the metaphysical or teleological level cohere with the explanations that you provide at a physical or efficient causal level, right? And so, just in the same way that if we looked at a watch, like, you know, to describe how the particular like meshing of the gears, right, occurs in the most perfect way, is to speak highly of the creator of the watch, right? And so in the same way for Leibniz, the fact that the world is ordered according to physical laws that we can come to understand and that are relatively simple and derivable from metaphysical principles reveals the great perfection of God in God's creation of the universe. Okay. So it might seem hard to understand how it is that this relates to free will, right? So it seems like if God is the direct cause of everything, that God established all the metaphysical laws of the universe, then it's very difficult to see how free will is possible, right? And this is something that's mentioned by almost everyone for their homework this week, which I believe demonstrates how powerful readers that you are in this class. Like, I think it would be an understatement for me to say that I am proud of y'all, because really the sort of problems that you point out collectively in Leibniz were the exact same considerations that Leibniz contemporaries had about his philosophical system too. That it seems like that God's knowledge about everything that will happen in the universe contradicts the idea that we have any sort of free will. This actually produces a famous correspondence between Leibniz and this Cartesian guy named Arnauld. And you actually have a little bit of that in your textbook if you choose to read it. But Arnauld brings up the exact same considerations that are brought up by students in class, right? That if God can perfectly foresee all actual and possible events, then God knows eternally all the actions that any person will perform, and this means that the person cannot do otherwise. So it seems like they're merely the plaything or puppet of God, right? And this is a concern that a lot of y'all had. Okay, so in order to distinguish Leibniz's philosophy, we have to talk about the difference between Leibniz and this philosopher, another Cartesian who we didn't have the time in class to discuss, but who is nonetheless very interesting, named Nicolas Malebranche. And there's a little bit, I believe, of Malebranche in your textbook too, if you're interested in that. But Malebranche was a Cartesian, and Malebranche is dealing with the mind-body problem as a Cartesian, you know, so like mind and body are fundamentally different stuff. Malebranche is willing to concede to the anti-Cartesian folks that Descartes' interactionism is not a good theory, because how can you explain how it is that the mind, which is not in space, can interact with or cause modifications in a body which is in space, right? If they're essentially different, how can they interact? That's the basic question. And Malebranche's answer is God. That God sort of at every moment where there should be like a mind-body interaction, that God produces a miracle that makes them interact with each other, right? And this is called occasionalism. And the reason why it's called occasionalism is because it's like at each occasion where there's a mind-body interaction, there's a miracle, right? That God ensures their correspondence with one another, that like every time you think like I'm gonna go to the living room, that you know you think that, and instead of your mind directly causing your body to do it, that God like you know stamps down that you know this indeed is going to happen, and you don't cause your body to do that, but God does, right? And so that's what occasionalism is. It's a solution to the mind-body problem where you just introduce God, and God produces the occasion for every mind-body interaction. Okay, now this theory is dissatisfying for a number of reasons. One reason why it's dissatisfying is that it makes every mind-body interaction a miracle, right? And that doesn't seem like so much an explanation for why, mind and body at least seem to interact so much, as to just say that we don't have an explanation, right? Two other problems. Number one, it makes God directly responsible for sin, right? So like in the case where I'm like, I'm going to do something morally wrong, I'm going to like steal a lollipop from a child, gimme, it seems like in these cases that God is directly responsible for your sin, right? That God is the one that makes your body do that. It's the one that makes your thoughts actually like correspond with the movements of your body, right? And so it seems like God at least has some degree of participation in your sin, which is not good for, a Christian conception of God. Another problem is that it seems to rob you of free will, right? If every action or event in your life is ultimately caused by God, then it becomes very puzzling how it is that you could ever say that like any action is a reflection of your own free will. And so to understand how free will is possible for Leibniz, we have to rigorously distinguish Leibniz from Malebranche, or Leibniz's pre-established harmony from Malebranche's occasionalism. And what Leibniz says is that God never acts on a human being directly, right? So unlike Malebranche, whenever I make a decision to go do something like to steal, the lollipop or whatever, God is not the cause of that decision that I make, right? God instead just establishes the order of creation in the universe. So, like the watchmaker, right? Leibniz just sort of like sets up the watch and then lets it run, right? God doesn't like directly cause all of the interactions of the gears, right, meshing together. He simply set it up so that the gears would work together, and then sort of like steps back, right? And for Leibniz, this reflects the perfection of God, is that God would create a creation that wouldn't need his sort of like constant approval or causal force or something like that. That it would actually better reflect God's perfection if he instead created some notion of creation that could keep going on independently of him, even though he established the order of that creation. And so what that means is that God can see that you are inclined without necessitating you towards a certain action. And so, one example that Leibniz talks about in the correspondence with Arnold is Adam, right? Adam, the sinner who went and took the forbidden fruit from the Garden of Eden, right? And what Leibniz says, which is very interesting, is that God did not create and could not create a vague Adam. So in other words, an Adam that would be like an Adam that is indeterminate between whether or not he is going to eat the forbidden fruit or not, right? And the reason why is principle of sufficient reason and law of continuity, right? If everything has a reason, then there's a specific reason for why Adam had to sin, for why Adam had to, eat the forbidden fruit. But it would be wrong to conceive of this as like Adam being caused to do it, like he were just merely a cause in the machine. Adam goes through a reasoning process where he decides that eating the forbidden fruit is the best. And that reasoning process is informed by everything that he knows about the world, right? And so Leibniz thinks that it doesn't make sense to imagine that you could create like a vague atom, like an atom with an indeterminate number of predicates, right? Or predicates that could change without any reason, right? This violates the principle of sufficient reason that orders all of God's creation. And moreover, because Adam reflects the whole universe, right? Adam is a monad, right? That Adam acts the way that he does because the entire system of the universe is set up the way that it is. And so God is not the direct cause of Adam's action. God simply caused the universe to be the way that it is. And then God can see, right, because God has perfect knowledge, that Adam will act in a certain way, right? But God himself does not cause or necessitate Adam to, eat the holy fruit, even if he can see that ultimately this could happen. So human beings have a free will, which is their ability to make decisions given certain circumstances, but God sets up those circumstances. He doesn't directly cause us to act. So like one specific formulation of the problem that was set up in our homework comes from Solomon Wolf. He had a really good sort of like thought experiment where he compares this to, cases of sexual assault. And so here, sort of a content warning. This does, I think, deal with sensitive material, but I think that it does so in a way that is appropriate to the class. Like we would say that somebody, a sexual assailant, right, that tries to get somebody drunk in order to have sex with them, right, they're modifying the circumstances such that that person could never act freely, right? And Solomon makes a similar point that if God is responsible for all of the circumstances, isn't it similar to this case where we think that this person isn't free because someone else has set up the circumstances in such a way that they can't make a free decision? Now, I think that Leibniz's response would be to emphasize the distinction between occasionalism and pre-established harmony. That, in the case that Solomon brings up, where there's a sexual assailant who tries to get someone drunk in order so that they will have sex with them, right? The victim, in this case, can't make a free decision because the assailant, the assaulter, has created conditions that directly operate on their ability to make a free decision. Now, what Leibniz will say is, hey, God never actually acts in a direct way on anyone's decisions, right? God simply set up the entire matrix of circumstances that could be relevant for your making a decision, and that's importantly different, right? God doesn't directly impede on anybody's ability to be free by knowing the consequences. God can just foresee all of the consequences of the fundamental laws that he sets up in the universe. Why? Because he's perfect, right? For us, we can always imagine gaps in our knowledge, ways in which we cannot clear and distinctly see all of the consequences of a certain principle, but God is defined by having every perfection, right? And so God will always see all of those circumstances. And y'all brought up even specifically section 13 of the Discourse on Metaphysics, and this is the exact section that Arnauld brings up in his correspondence. So y'all are super, super smart for bringing this up as a problem with Leibniz. But I think that if you meditate on Leibniz's notion of primary truths and metaphysical principles, that you can see how he tries, at least, to get out of this problem by kind of saying, like, God, in the same way that God isn't responsible for each individual ways that the gears mesh in the watch, right? He simply knew that they would mesh up that way, but he doesn't directly cause it. In the same way, God, Leibniz says, inclines without necessitating, which means that God sort of sets up all of the circumstances for our reasoning processes, but doesn't actually go through those processes for us. So this was kind of a long video. I apologize for it being a little bit long, but I think that it's very important that we get a sense of Leibniz's notion of metaphysical laws, because they really help us see like why it is that there are metaphysical laws in the universe, right? How those metaphysical laws can interact with physical laws to provide an explanation for phenomena in the universe, right? But also how then, if we think of God as the most perfect watchmaker, why it is that God is not the direct cause of all of our actions, right? Why it is that we can still be free in spite of the fact that God in some way sets up the conditions for our actions. So I hope that's helpful. I know that a lot of y'all said that this material is very difficult, and it is, right? And I'll be reading your reading responses very carefully to make sure that, if you have questions about some specific part of Leibniz, that I can make sure that I address it next week in our final Leibniz section. Also, I wanted to mention I am going to be changing the syllabus to add just one more reading on the last week of Leibniz. I know that it's a little bit hard because your midterms are due, and so I apologize for that. But the thing that we are reading for next week, the Monadology, is only 7 pages long. And in a lot of ways, it's just sort of is Leibniz's later recapitulation of the arguments that he made in the Discourse on Metaphysics. So the thing that I'm going to be providing is a dialogue with a sort of like imagined Cartesian, right? And so we can try to get even more of Leibniz's interaction with these Cartesians, because it's very important for understanding how his system is set up. But I will make an announcement and you will receive all that information. I hope this is helpful. Please let me know if it is or if it isn't, what we still need to discuss. And I hope you all have a great week. All right, bye.